Jesus did this, the first of his signs in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory. Please be seated. There was a moment a couple of weeks ago as we were in the middle of packing up a 3.5-year-old and a 9-month-old and myself and Nicole for a 2-week trip that involved driving to Boston and flying to Atlanta and waiting 2 hours in the Atlanta airport, then flying to Key West and hoping we could time it just right to meet my parents at the Key West airport to go to the house we were all staying in. Then Nicole and I wondered, what are we doing? To look ahead to this travel schedule was incredibly daunting. I was envisioning the best of scenarios involving me standing in the middle of an airplane trying to bounce Jeremiah up and down, with Francis hurling demand after demand at us that we could not meet within the confines of the small space of a plane. And that was the best case scenario. That was assuming there were no flight delays or cancellations, that we weren't going to get stuck somewhere in the Atlanta airport for an indeterminate amount of time, or have something get canceled along the way to throw all of it off. There were moments of us asking ourselves, are we crazy for doing this? And getting incredibly frustrated with Nicole's stepsister, who decided to have a wedding in Key West when she could have just had it in New Jersey, when everyone could have driven within 4 hours of where they lived. But we made it. And yeah, it was a little bumpy, it was a little testy at times, but we made it down there. We stepped off that airplane in Key West, Florida, to 65-degree air, with the palm trees waving in a gentle breeze coming off the Gulf of Mexico. My parents were there waiting for us inside the airport. We got to the place we were staying, and just with each passing minute and over the course of a few hours, I could feel the tension that had been steadily building up in me for days start to ratchet down, start to release little by little by little, and to settle into that experience that would be where we would stay for the next 6 days. I'd been dreading embarking on this journey, but when we were there, I realized that it was exactly the thing that we needed. Over the course of our time there, we got to attend Nicole's stepsister's wedding, this incredible ceremony on the grounds of the Ernest Hemingway house, surrounded by beautiful flora and Hemingway's much beloved 6-toed cats, or the descendants of those cats. And we were there surrounded by Nicole's family, as well as with my parents there to watch the boys so we could attend the wedding. And I experienced and witnessed all of these moments that truly filled me up. From seeing family members gathered around Francis and Jeremiah, to simply love them, to be with them, interested in who they are and who they were becoming. We stood on the shore, on the beaches of the Atlantic, and I watched as my dad taught Francis how to cast a fishing rod the same way he taught me 30 years ago. We watched family members walking with Francis into the surf and the waves, for him to delight in the rushing of the waves tide coming in, running back and forth into the surf. I watched as Francis took one timid step after another into the swimming pool next to the place where we were staying. At first terrified that he would sink into the water, but eventually trusting that life jacket more and more, until finally I saw him lift one foot off, then another, and let himself float until he let go of the side of the pool altogether, to let himself float into the water, trusting that he would be kept aloft. I saw Nicole get to spend more intentional time with her siblings than she has in years, all of them together, and to feel the love that surrounded us, to realize that we were in the midst of our community, one of our communities, the sets of these two branches of our family that had come there that surrounded us to support us and to support Francis and Jeremiah. In the midst of this trip that at times I viewed almost as a burden, we were filled up by the grace that we received from the love that surrounded us and from the experience of witnessing two people exchanging vows with one another and pledging to spend their life together. Our gospel reading this week takes place at a wedding in Cana. Jesus is there with his mother Mary and with his disciples. They've been invited as guests. They have no place of prominence. They're not expected to do anything. This is before Jesus' time has come. So really, there aren't many people who really know much about him. He's sort of unassuming there, a part of the crowd, a part of the partygoers there to simply enjoy the evening. And then all of a sudden, Mary looks and notices that they have run out of wine, which would be a travesty for any wedding, but especially in this time. It would have been a major faux pas on the part of the hosts, a breach in the sort of stricter decorum around hospitality, a sign of their inability to provide for the partygoers, a breach in their social expectations. Seeing this and wanting to spare the host this, and maybe to see the party keep going, Mary nudges Jesus and says, "Can't you do something about it?" And at first Jesus demurs. "Woman, what is the concern is this to you and me? My time has not yet come." But just as soon as he says it, Mary calls over the servants and says, "Do whatever he tells you." So Jesus has them fill up the 6 stone jars full of the water for the rite of purification, and then to draw out a pitcher from those jugs, and to bring it to the steward. And when they bring it to the steward, he dips the ladle in and takes a sip and realizes that this is the best wine he has had all evening. The water has been transformed. The party can go on. On one hand, I think it'd be easy to see this miracle as somewhat superfluous. It almost comes off as more of a party trick than anything. Water into wine. And looking at the rest of the miracles, there are things like healings and casting out of demons. There are these things that have a more apparent usefulness to them. But for that time and that place, wine was more than a luxury item. It was more than something nice to have to lubricate the social wheels of a party. It was an essential foodstuff. It was a vital part of life. It was a way of preserving the harvest, of making sure the fruit of the vine would not rot when the grapes fell off of the vine, but would be available to the people whenever they need it. In a time when the availability of clean and pure water was dubious at best, wine was a sure thing. It existed not as a luxury, but something essential to nourishing the people. And so Jesus' miracle of turning water into wine wasn't just some party trick, but was about nourishing the people present there. It was about giving them the thing not only that they wanted, but that they needed. It was about meeting a need of the community. In that miracle, Jesus reveals that his role as Savior is about that, about nourishing God's people, giving them the sustenance and the strength that they need in order to meet the demands of each and every day. Not only at a bare minimum level, he didn't just turn it into any wine, but turn it into the best wine they had had all evening. It's about God providing for God's people what they need and more, enough that they are overflowing with an abundance of that nourishment, an abundance of God's grace. It is in that overflowing abundance that this miracle is that the value of this miracle lies. It is in that overflowing of abundance that it reveals who Jesus is, both to his disciples and at the beginning and to the crowd itself. This theme of nourishment is echoed, I think, in Paul's second letter to the Corinthians. And Paul is talking about how God's Spirit will nourish us with the gifts that we need in order to meet the needs of our community. All the gifts of the Spirit are to be used for the common good, he writes. They're to be used for building one another up. The disciples of Christ are called to nourish one another just as God nourishes us. Just as God gives us the grace that we need to meet each day, so are we to build one another up, to nourish one another's spirits, to feed each other when we need to be fed, so that we might be able to be God's love in the world. We might be able to be God's hands and feet in our communities. Over those 6 days in Key West, we were nourished. We were nourished by the presence of family and friends, by the love and care that they showed to us. We were nourished by the experience of being at a wedding and seeing the love exchanged between two people, their commitment to one another. We were nourished by God's creation, by warm air and ocean water, by the chance to see our kids who are growing up taking on new challenges, themselves feeling nourished enough to be confident to take on new risks and to try new things. And the nourishment didn't stop there. After our time in Key West, we flew up to Sewanee, Tennessee, where we got to witness an ordination. It was the ordination of Ashley Jane Booths, AJ, who was ordained as a deacon with Nicole 6-7 months ago, but was being ordained as a priest. And Bishop Robb was down there to officiate the service. And it happened there in Sewanee, Tennessee, because that is where she is going to be spending her ministry for this foreseeable future. Along with being ordained as a priest, she is also a postulant in the community of St. Mary, the Episcopal convent where 15 years ago I got to spend a year and a half of my life. So I was nourished by seeing all of these parts of my world coming together and weaving in with one another in this place. And I was nourished by the words of Bishop Robb's sermon. He reminded me, he reminded all who were gathered that all of our callings, not ordained people, but every one of us, by virtue of our baptism, by virtue of being one of God's people, is called to do this nourishing and healing work of the gospel. When Jesus says to Peter, "Feed my sheep," he is talking to all of us. We are called to feed one another, to nourish one another's spirits, and to literally feed one another when we are hungry. That is the work of discipleship, to let ourselves be fed and nourished by God's grace, reaching out to us from the communities that we are a part of, and in and through God's creation. To let ourselves be nourished so that we might in turn nourish one another, that we might do the work of feeding the world, both attending to the physical needs of others, but also the spiritual needs. And I think that is a gospel that we need now as much as we ever do. We stand here on the eve of Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And I'm reminded of the unfinished work of the dream that MLK Jr. articulated. That dream of a beloved community, of a more just world in which all people are able to live together. A world in which justice reigns, in which all people have equal opportunity and equal to access to the things that they need to nourish them. That is a dream that has yet to be realized. And we, as followers of Christ who seek to serve God and to help realize that dream, need nourishment. We need to be filled by God's grace in whatever way that comes. From the communities that we're a part of, here at this table on Sunday mornings, through God's holy word, and through all of our encounters with grace over the course of our weeks and of our lives. It's also the eve of a presidential inauguration. It's a transitional point in the life of our country that is going to be tumultuous. That with any shifting of administration, there's this redefinition of who we are as a people. And as we enter into this new phase, as it always is, it is incumbent upon us to be nourished for the work ahead of us, to continue to be voices advocating for God's love, advocating for God's justice, standing in solidarity with the marginalized of our society, being willing to walk with those who are struggling to get by in this country and in this world. My prayer for all of us is that we might be nourished for the work ahead of us. As Jesus turned water into wine at the wedding in Cana of Galilee, may we also receive the life-giving food and drink that God gives us, embodied in the grace we receive from one another, from this table, and from God's self. May God feed us with the food we need. May our thirst be slaked with the drink that we need. May we be filled with what we need to face everything ahead of us with courage and confidence that God goes with us and that we are a part of a larger community. May that nourish our spirits as we seek to nourish one another.